8 seconds. That's all it will take for this to become your secret and your burden, because what I'm about to tell you was never meant for the ears of ordinary men. It was locked behind vaults, buried under revolutions, rewritten by victors, and sanitized by governments who tremble at the truth. They want you to believe this story is finished, that the final chapter of the Romanovs ended in a basement in 1918. But the dead don't stay dead when a nation builds its soul upon their bones. So listen carefully. Imagine a dynasty that ruled a sixth of the earth. 303 years of divine authority, unstoppable armies, palaces made from marble and winter, a family who believed themselves chosen by God himself, only to vanish in one night, their blood soaking the stone floor of a house that still refuses to give up its ghosts. For 70 years, speaking their name carried risk. Even whispering their memory meant you were a traitor. History shoved them into a locked drawer. But here's the thing about drawers. They eventually get opened. Before the bullets, before the propaganda, before the saints' icons in Orthodox churches. There was a warning. A prophecy written not in scripture but in fear. If the Romanovs fall, Russia will fall with them. And when they did, Russia bled for a century. The story begins much earlier, in a time when the world was darker, hungrier, and ruled by the cold hand of fate. In 1613, the Russian throne sat empty. Famine stalked every village. Foreign invaders occupied Moscow. People burned icons to stay warm, praying the smoke might reach a silent god. This was the time of troubles, and it lived up to the name. And then, from the shadows, a boy no one expected stepped into history. Mikhail Romanov, 16 years old, trembling as priests forced a crown onto his head. He didn't win the throne. He didn't inherit it by might. He was chosen out of desperation, hope wearing a child's face. Across the frozen roads, survivors dropped to their knees to see him pass, because if he failed, there would be no more Russia. A country breaks faster than a man, and every peasant understood that the line between empire and extinction was just one heartbeat wide. But Mikhail didn't fail, and from that moment, the Romanovs didn't just rule, they became Russia. For 303 years, emperors and empresses from this one bloodline shaped the world. Peter the Great, who carved a new empire with iron and will. Catherine the Great, who expanded it into a God-devouring beast. Alexandra II, who freed millions and was murdered for it. Nicholas II, the last Tsar. A man destined to drown in history's tide. This was not simply royalty. This was a dynasty built like a fortress, forged in ice and sacrifice. But greatness always demands a price, and the Romanovs paid in tragedy. Russia modernized, but its spirit cracked. Industrial towers rose, but beneath them, peasants starved. Belief turned to resentment. Order rotted into paranoia. Revolution spread like infection, feeding on every injustice, real or imagined. And when the final blow struck, it wasn't politics that delivered it. It was a curse of the blood. Nicholas and Alexandra birthed one son, a fragile heir whose veins betrayed him. Hemophilia, a disease that turned royal bruises into death sentences. Every stumble, every slip, a prayer for survival. And into that fear slithered a serpent, dressed as a holy man. Rasputin, savior to the throne, poison to the empire. But that is later. For now, what you must understand is this. The Romanovs believed themselves protected by God. Their rule was not only political, it was sacred. The entire empire rested on a single doctrine. The Tsar is God's voice on earth. But if that voice ever fell silent, what would become of the world that worshipped it? Here's the truth no textbook will tell you. The Romanovs did not lose power because they were weak. They lost because the world was terrified of what they represented. A divine monarchy in an age demanding control through ideology, not faith. Revolutions don't just topple rulers. They erase symbols. The family became a liability. The Bolsheviks knew it. The West knew it. Even some within the palace knew it. Because one truth lingered like smoke in locked rooms. Where the Romanovs lived, Russia still belonged to them. Destroying them wasn't punishment, it was prevention. Imagine that night in 1918. A small room, a terrified family, gunfire that would echo for generations, officially execution, realistically ritual, a nation severing its connection to God, because if the people could no longer kneel to a Tsar, they could kneel to the state. 3 centuries of divine rule, erased in minutes, their bodies hidden, their names forbidden, their legacy rewritten by the victors. But here's what no assassin planned for. When you kill a king, he becomes a martyr. When you kill a child, they become a memory. And when you kill a sacred family, they become saints. Years later, bones were found, buried, exhumed, identified, venerated. In 2000, the Russian Orthodox Church canonized them, elevating the last Romanovs to holy status. Imagine that. The dynasty the revolution tried to erase returned more powerful than ever. Icons now hang in churches across Russia. Candles burn for them. Pilgrims whisper prayers to them. The state that slaughtered them now must share power with their memory. But wait. Why do the powerful fear the dead so much? Because the dead cannot be controlled. Because the dead cannot be threatened. Because the dead, when turned into legend, can rise. This is not just history. This is the story of what happens when an empire tries to bury its soul and fails. You're not just watching a documentary tonight. You are entering a forbidden archive, one that has been sealed for a very long time. Take a breath, because Section 2 will pull you deeper than you've ever gone. And once you step inside the Romanov truth, there is no going back. History often tells us that empires fall because they grow old or weak, but the Romanov Empire did not decay. It was murdered. The world knew that as long as the blood of the Tsars lived, Russia could never truly belong to the revolution. And so we must look not only at how they died, but at why the most powerful forces of the 20th century united to ensure their disappearance. The Romanovs stood as the last pillar of divine monarchy in a world shifting violently toward radical ideology and global financial power. Their rule came from heaven, their enemies demanded obedience from earth. You cannot have two gods. For 3 centuries, Romanov rulers carried not only crowns, but burdens, a vast land stretching across 11 time zones, a peasantry trapped between worship and hunger, and elites who dressed in European fashions while sharpening daggers behind their backs. But here is the secret that transforms this story from tragedy into threat. The Romanovs held a moral legitimacy unmatched by any contemporary power. They did not rule because they manipulated masses or controlled narratives. They ruled because millions believed the Tsar was chosen by God. That belief is a currency more dangerous than money or soldiers. It makes men fight for something greater than survival. It makes them die willingly. When the industrial age arrived, fueled by factories, steel, and ideologies spreading like a virus through printing presses and universities, the old religious bond between ruler and ruled became the enemy of every system that wanted obedience without divinity. The Romanovs didn't represent oppression. They represented loyalty that no institution, not a parliament, not a party, not a secret police, could replicate. So while the public story of their end points to World War I, military defeat, and incompetent governance, that is merely a curtain. Behind it, a coalition of revolutionaries, opportunists, and international financiers saw their chance. Removing a single family would allow them to reshape not just Russia, but the entire balance of global power. Nicholas II was not a tyrant. He was a miscast king in an era sharpened for wolves. His fatal flaw was belief that his people loved him enough to endure suffering, belief that his role as God's anointed protector meant the earth would not dare crumble beneath his feet. He underestimated the force of resentment when hunger replaces faith. By the early 20th century, Russia had become a paradox. Modern weapons, ancient obedience, factories roaring, peasants praying, glittering ballrooms masking a nation ready to ignite. Revolution did not start in the slums. It started in the minds of men who tasted Europe's promises but returned to Russia to find nothing changed. Their anger needed a face to blame. Autocracy provided a perfect target. And then fate itself delivered the match. The Tsarevich Alexei's fragile blood. Alexandra, the empress, turned to mysticism and Rasputin because science had no cure. The miracle worker from Siberia became the empire's most dangerous symbol, a peasant controlling a throne that could not bleed without him. Ministers, generals, bureaucrats, all saw their power slip, into the hands of a man who stank of alcohol and sacrilege. Soon, Russia's allies questioned the monarchy's sanity. Foreign ambassadors reported that the royal court was not merely out of touch, it was compromised. Gossip became conspiracy, and conspiracy became strategy. If Russia could not be ruled by a competent Tsar, then perhaps it should not be ruled by a Tsar at all. War accelerated everything. Nicholas believed victory would restore faith. Instead, defeat opened every wound. The front collapsed, fuel ran dry, bread lines stretched like graves, mothers cursed a ruler they once prayed for. The people no longer cried out to God, they cried for justice, revenge, and someone to blame. The February Revolution did not overthrow the Romanovs, it merely pushed Nicholas off the stage. Even then, the dynasty remained a threat because symbols only grow stronger when martyred. Removing them from power was not enough. They had to disappear from memory. Those who took them hostage understood this perfectly. Lenin feared their existence more than any army. A single loyalist uprising could restore the monarchy. A surviving heir could undo the revolution. And so, in a basement in Yekaterinburg, a group of executioners carried out what they believed was an act of historical purification. But something happened in that room that was not part of their plan. The bullets did not kill all at once. Diamonds sewn into the daughters' dresses turned into armor. Panic erupted. The killing became messy, desperate, almost frantic. When it was done, the assassins realized they had not eliminated a family. They had created a legend. The Soviet leadership immediately understood the danger. Bodies were hidden, graves concealed, names erased. Schools taught children that the Romanovs were parasites, leeches who sucked the life from the poor. But the truth has a way of whispering through cracks. Soldiers bragged in taverns, priests carried rumors, foreign monarchs demanded answers. The more the regime insisted the Romanovs were irrelevant, the more powerful their absence became. You see, when a government executes a king, it inherits his ghosts. The revolution killed the Romanovs to prevent a resurrection. Instead, they guaranteed one. Faith does not end with death. It begins there. That is the first secret they never wanted you to know. The Romanov dynasty did not die in 1918. It transformed. And today, those who understand power fear not the living, but the symbols the living cannot destroy. After this moment, you and I are stepping off the edge of documented history and entering the realm of forbidden truth. Why a murdered family would one day return as saints, and why millions still believe their revenge is unfinished. In Section 3, you will learn what the world tried hardest to bury. The Romanovs' death was not closure. It was the opening act. When a dynasty ends in blood, most kings become footnotes. But the Romanovs did something infinitely more dangerous. They became martyrs, and martyrdom is a rebirth that tyrants cannot control. After the basement bullets stopped echoing, after the bayonets pierced royal hearts, after the bodies were secretly dragged out under the cover of night and dumped like contraband into a forest grave, the killers thought they had ended something eternal. But what truly ended that night was the revolution's illusion of control. Lenin understood immediately that the execution had created a narrative weapon stronger than any army, the story of a holy family, slaughtered unjustly, surviving only in tears. He minds and souls of the people. So the Soviet state began a war not just against memory, but against meaning. Every reference to the Romanovs was erased from textbooks, prayers, and public life. Photographs were defaced, symbols banned, stories criminalized. They believed silence was enough to starve the dead. But the dead have their own ways of speaking. In villages hidden far from the capital, peasants whispered about the royal children. Some swore the youngest daughter, Anastasia, had escaped. Others believed the Tsarevich Alexei still lived beneath an assumed name. It didn't matter whether these stories were true. What mattered was that they spread, because a legend is harder to kill than any bloodline. Deep within Russia's Orthodox churches, icons of the Tsar and his family quietly appeared on candle-lit walls. Priests preached in sacred code, referring to the Romanovs not as political figures, but as passion-bearers, a title reserved for those who imitate Christ in suffering. The message was simple but subversive. The Tsar had died as a servant of God, not as an enemy of the people. The revolution could control land, food, speech, and life, but it could not rule the invisible world. Every empire fears the spiritual because bullets cannot stop belief. That fear intensified when rumors surfaced. The executioners had failed to destroy all the bodies. The Bolsheviks panicked. They executed more witnesses. They sealed archives. They constructed lies atop lies, but lies sink when truth is heavier. By the 1970s, the truth began to crawl back out of the dark. A clandestine investigation uncovered bones in the forest near Yekaterinburg. The Soviet government, terrified of the religious and political consequences, buried the evidence again. They preferred a shallow grave for the truth, but shallow graves always rise. When the Soviet Union began collapsing in the 1980s, these long, silent voices broke free like trapped steam from a pressured pipe. DNA analysis confirmed what many already suspected. The remains belonged to Nicholas, Alexandra, and 3 of their children. The revolutionaries had not even accomplished the finality of death. They had left witnesses underground. And then came a moment so blasphemous to Soviet ideology that it struck their entire narrative like a hammer. In the year 2000, the Russian Orthodox Church declared Nicholas II and his family saints. Imagine that. A nation that once executed them as criminals now knelt before their icons, asking for intercession, protection, forgiveness. The Soviet Union's greatest sin was transformed into its greatest shame. The revolution killed the Romanovs to claim absolute authority. But by turning them into saints, the Church reclaimed something far greater, legitimacy over the Russian soul. And this is where history becomes dangerous. Because sainthood is not storytelling. Sainthood is recruitment. When a family becomes holy, they do not disappear into heaven. They return to influence earth. They gain something the revolution could never allow: eternal loyalty. Think about that. When a king rules from a throne, people can revolt. When a king rules from an icon, revolt becomes heresy. The Bolsheviks didn't just lose political control, they lost metaphysical control. Their greatest victory detonated into their ultimate defeat. And now I must ask you directly, because you are not here to simply watch history. You are here to see through it. If you have followed the story this far, you are part of that forbidden lineage of men who seek truth that institutions fear. So I want you to declare something in the comments twice, so that the algorithm and your subconscious both register the transformation that is happening inside you in this moment. Comment this phrase exactly: the crown returns. Write it once for the world to see and once for the world to fear. Because by acknowledging that phrase, you symbolically align yourself with the side of history that power tried to erase. And let me tell you something most historians will never admit. Revolutions are temporary. Monarchies are inevitable. The Romanovs did not lose because the people hated them. They lost because new powers wanted a world where no one answered to God. But look at Russia now. Look at the double-headed eagle restored. Look at churches filled. Look at saints wearing crowns in painted halls where Lenin once forbade even a cross. Something is shifting again, and the Romanovs stand at the center of that shift. So the question becomes, did their reincarnation as saints truly mark an end or a rebirth? And if they were reborn into legend, what exactly have they come back to accomplish? You might think their story concludes with canonization and closure, but the truth is far more unsettling. Because sainthood is not a memorial, it is a rallying call. And empires built on memory have a habit of rising when the world least expects them. In Section 4, we descend deeper into forces that understood long ago, when God crowns a family, bullets cannot take the kingdom. They can only pause the throne. The resurrection of the Romanovs was only the beginning. The most dangerous truths in history are not the ones governments deny, but the ones they quietly fear. And nothing has terrified the architects of Maititskir. Odin power, more than the possibility that the Romanovs, the family they tried to erase, retain a legitimacy more ancient and magnetic than any political system created to replace them. When the Soviet Empire collapsed in 1991, it wasn't just an economic failure or ideological breakdown. It was a spiritual vacuum opening across the land. A nation that had been told for 70 years to worship the state suddenly found itself with nothing to kneel before. In moments like that, history does not simply remember, it resurrects. The two-headed eagle returned to Russia's flag. Imperial songs were played again. Palaces reopened. The power structure of atheistic revolution cracked, and from those cracks rose the ghosts of the monarchy it tried so hard to bury. But this revival did not come from nostalgia or nationalism. It came from something older, a truth woven into Russian identity itself, that authority flows not from elections or parties, but from divine order. For centuries, the Tsar was not just a ruler, he was the physical anchor of heaven's will. Remove him, and the nation wanders the wilderness. The Russian soul did not evolve to be governed by committees or manifestos. It evolved to be led by a sacred protector. That is why the death of Nicholas II and his family did not sever the bond, it intensified it. Their execution was meant to prove that the revolution had become the new god. Instead, it exposed the revolution's greatest fear, that a murdered monarch can wield more influence than a living one. And so, as the archives reopened and the canonization elevated the Romanovs into the rank of saints, something primal began to stir. Pilgrimages to their graves multiplied. Soldiers swore oaths before their icons. Politicians invoked their names with caution, as if speaking too loudly might summon what the bullets failed to kill. The state, newly reborn yet still fragile, realized it needed the Romanovs' ghost, but could not afford their return. So it chose a strategy older than empire. Absorb the sacred before it overpowers the throne. The Church and the Kremlin began a quiet alliance, each aware that the other held half of the keys to Russia's destiny. The Church possesses spiritual legitimacy. The state holds material force. Together, they keep the crown buried, but ready. And here is where the story sharpens into something far more unsettling. Many Russians today believe the Romanovs did not simply become saints. They became symbols waiting for the right crisis to reawaken a monarchy that sleeps beneath modern politics like a hibernating dragon. Russia is a nation that rises most fiercely when cornered, and every collapse in its history has been followed by a return to absolute authority. The Mongol invasions gave rise to Moscow's grand princes. The time of troubles birthed the Romanovs. The Bolshevik tyranny forged the post-Soviet resurgence. In Russia, chaos is not an ending, it is a fertilization. So ask yourself, what do you think the world looks like from the perspective of a nation that has fallen and risen more times than any empire on Earth? Do you think they believe history is fragile? Or do they believe thrones are inevitable? Many in the West laugh at monarchy as outdated pageantry. Russians do not. To them, monarchy is not a memory. It is a muscle that has been tensed, strained, beaten, and now rests with coiled patience under the skin of the state. That is why the Romanovs, canonized, revered, and mourned, are not merely dead rulers. They are a dormant mandate. a sleeping claim to power, a potential that terrifies those who built their world upon the promise that kings are gone forever. Because if a single nation proves that divine monarchy can return, then every regime built on the illusion of progress suddenly looks replaceable. The West rewrote history to convince you that democracy is the final form of civilization. Russia knows better. Russia remembers the centuries before. Russia remembers who commanded armies and shaped continents. Russia remembers God's anointed warriors wearing crowns of gold and icon light. And Russia remembers that their story did not end in that basement. This is why whispers continue. Whispers about heirs, about legitimate descendants, about movements gaining traction in the shadows. Even today, certain officials meet quietly with nobles bearing the Romanov name. They call it tradition, but tradition is often the first step toward restoration. The elites understand the stakes. A restored monarchy would not simply shift power. It would redefine identity, loyalty, and destiny for over 140 million people. If a throne rises again, ideologues become irrelevant. If a saint becomes sovereign, revolution becomes sin. And the modern world, built on doubt, skepticism, and fluid truth, cannot survive a resurrection of faith that carries a sword. This is the second secret they never wanted you to realize. The Romanovs were the last dynasty chosen by God in the eyes of millions. Their death did not end that belief, it crystallized it. And now, every candle lit before their icons is a quiet protest against the world order that replaced them. The empire was never buried. It was entombed, and tombs are built with the expectation of reopening. In Section 5, we go deeper into the forces that ensured the Romanovs' death was not the end. Because to understand the future of power, you must ask the question only the brave dare consider. What happens to the world if the crown returns? When a dynasty is declared dead, most people assume its bloodline died with it. But royalty does not vanish the way common families do. Crowns are not jewelry, they are claim. And claim is a weapon that survives execution. The Romanovs understood this long before the firing squad aimed their rifles. That is why the bullets were fired at a family, not at a government. It wasn't Nicholas alone who threatened the revolution. It was any possibility that his descendants could one day rise and demand the return of a throne that billions of rubles and millions of lives had been spent to steal. Yet the Bolsheviks never managed to kill every heir. Several Romanovs fled Russia before the night in Yekaterinburg, scattered across Europe like embers waiting for wind. Princes and princesses with ancestral legitimacy, some impoverished, others welcomed into foreign courts, all carrying a name that could topple a regime if enough people believed in it again. The Soviets labeled them parasites, relics, fugitives. That narrative worked until communism rotted. When the USSR fell apart in 1991, something surprising happened. Russians began searching for royalty again. Newspapers interviewed exiled nobles. Television dramas romanticized the dynasty. The idea of monarchy returned to the public imagination, like a muscle remembering strength. And this shift did not go unnoticed by those who watch history from above. Governments, intelligence agencies, the church, and international financial interests all understood that the Romanov name was no longer a ghost. It was becoming a magnet. By the early 2000s, several Romanov descendants quietly moved back to Russia. They attended ceremonies, visited graves, and appeared beside political and religious elites who smiled warmly but kept them at a safe distance. Why the caution? Why the cheer? Because acknowledging a living Romanov heir is not a gesture of peace. It is a loaded question. What if this is the rightful ruler? And that question can destabilize an entire system. Imagine a Russia in crisis. Economic collapse, war exhaustion, internal rebellion. Imagine the people losing faith in politicians, oligarchs, and ministries bloated with corruption. In that moment of chaos, who would they look to? A bureaucrat? A banker? A party official? Or a sainted family whose suffering mirrors their own? Faith is a currency that always returns to circulation. Even today, polling indicates that a significant percentage of Russians would support a constitutional or semi-sacred monarchy if the right figure emerged. And that potential terrifies those who depend on the absence of kings. The most persistent rumor surrounds one particular claimant. Not a pretender, not a fantasist, but a legally recognized head of the House of Romanov. She is received by patriarchs, invited to imperial anniversaries, and welcomed into Kremlin halls. Officials bow slightly when they greet her. A detail small to the untrained eye, but seismic to those who understand symbolism. They bow because they know the past is not finished. They bow because they sense the throne beneath the floor. They bow because legitimacy is a shadow that stretches centuries, and hers is longer than theirs. These heirs are not assembling armies. They do not make speeches calling for rebellion. They do not openly seek power. That is what makes them dangerous. The Romanovs have learned what their ancestors never could: patience. The modern world expects power to scream, but true power whispers, and when people grow tired of noise, they follow the whisper. Some say the Romanovs will never return because monarchy is outdated. But monarchy is not fashion. Monarchy is identity, and identity is the most resilient for see on earth. A country can lose industry, territory, wars, and wealth. But if it remembers who it is, it can rise again with terrifying speed. Every enemy of Russia has learned that lesson the hard way. The greatest mistake the revolutionaries ever made was believing that killing a king would kill the concept of kingship. But concepts do not bleed. Concepts endure. And in Russia, the concept of the Tsar is not a story you read in a book. It is a prophecy waiting for fulfillment. This is the third secret they hoped you'd never consider. The Romanovs are not extinct. They are dormant, a dynasty placed into cold storage, not to be forgotten, but to be preserved. A crown hidden instead of melted. A bloodline protected instead of polluted. They exist exactly where history wants them when it is ready to repeat itself. The past is not behind us. The past is a predator circling its prey, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. And if you think world powers are comfortable with that possibility, think again. There are forces today working tirelessly to ensure that if monarchy rises anywhere, it rises under their terms, not God's. They fear a ruler chosen by destiny, because destiny does not negotiate. It does not compromise. It does not ask permission. It claims. In Section 6, we step even deeper, into the psychological mechanisms of control that were specifically engineered to replace the monarchy, to erase obedience to God and replace it with obedience to the state, and why those mechanisms are failing faster than anyone expected. Because the battle between crown and ideology never ended. It merely went underground. Revolutions are not merely political coups. They are surgeries performed on the human soul. To kill a monarchy, you must do more than kill a monarch. You must extract from the people the very idea that authority can descend from the divine. That was the real objective of the Bolsheviks. Their bullets targeted bodies, but their true weapons sliced through belief. For centuries, Russians worshipped their Tsar not as a mere ruler, but as the living intersection between heaven and earth. When Nicholas II fell, that spiritual anchor was violently severed, and in its place the revolution erected a new religion, the worship of the state. The Soviet Union understood something Western democracies still struggle to grasp. People do not naturally obey governments. They obey symbols. They obey myths. They obey narratives that make their suffering meaningful. Communism seized that truth and reshaped it into doctrine. Instead of God, they gave the people ideological purity. Instead of saints, they offered martyrs of labor and war. Instead of royal portraits, they displayed Lenin's embalmed corpse as a relic in a secular cathedral. Instead of church bells, they filled the sky with victory parades and factory sirens, the sound of a new faith demanding sacrifice. And sacrifice came. Not from choice, but command. Because when a state claims ultimate authority, disobedience becomes a sin against progress. Millions were tortured, starved, executed, or disappeared into gulags because power without divinity still craves worship. It just punishes disbelief more brutally. The Romanovs were erased because their existence was proof that a higher loyalty once existed, one that could rise again. The revolutionaries replaced prayer with propaganda, liturgy with legislation, creed with constitution. Children were raised to believe that their only father was the party, their only savior the state, their only heaven the future. That psychological engineering worked while the machine fed them victories, industrial triumphs, nuclear breakthroughs, wartime glory. But here is the fatal flaw. A state cannot feed a soul. When bread grows scarce and pride runs dry, an ideology that promises utopia becomes indistinguishable from tyranny that delivers nothing. And when belief collapses, the people look backward, not forward, searching for the last moment they felt whole. In Russia, that memory leads to the same place, the monarchy. Even those who suffered under the empire found themselves drawn to its certainty. Under a Tsar, life was harsh, but purpose was clear. Under the state, life became a factory line with no horizon and no God. When the Soviet Union finally crumbled under its own weight, the architects of its control discovered the most terrifying truth of all. The spiritual instincts they tried to kill were merely dormant, buried under fear and hunger. When the chains broke, people did not run toward democracy as Western leaders predicted. They ran back toward faith. Golden domes reappeared. Icons resurfaced. Priests, once hunted, now blessed soldiers and politicians. The church returned as the soul of the nation, yet something remained missing. A father, a protector, a symbol of continuity. People did not want another ideology. They wanted destiny again. But destiny requires a vessel, a figure who embodies the eternal power of the land. And that is why the Romanov story began crawling out of the grave the moment the Soviet state collapsed. That is why their canonization electrified those who saw in their suffering a mirror of Russia's own. That is why their memory resurrected faster than any political movement could control. The state that replaced God learned too late that a godless throne is always temporary. When the spiritual vacuum widened, new forces and old protectors began to fill it. And now, a conflict beneath the surface dictates the future. A war between institutional authority and sacred legitimacy. One side governs by fear. The other inspires loyalty by blood and sacrifice. One relies on surveillance. The other relies on memory. One is built on force. The other is built on myth. A myth that endured gulags, famine, propaganda, and bullets. So ask yourself, which power is more durable? The one that depends on control, or the one that survives death? The greatest fear of every modern leader is that the people will remember they once belonged to something larger than politics, a lineage sanctified by both faith and highs. Story. Because if they do remember, then the structures of power built on ideology crumble like plaster over a forgotten cathedral wall. The fourth secret is now clear. The Soviet Union did not destroy the monarchy. It only hid the wound that monarchy's absence created. And wounds become dangerous when they begin to heal. In Section 7, we reveal the moment where exile met opportunity, when surviving Romanovs and resurgent faith forged the first whispers of return. Because revolutions rewrite the present, monarchies wait for the future, and the future is creeping closer than anyone anticipated. When a lineage as powerful as the Romanovs is exiled, it does not become irrelevant. It becomes radioactive. Every surviving family member carried more than memory. They carried the potential for restoration. Across Europe, as the 20th century unfolded in fire and propaganda, the Romanovs remained a living question. Which one of them, if destiny allowed, could wear the crown again? Western governments observed them with cold interest, fearful that a single charismatic heir could unify Russian exiles, spark uprisings, or inspire legions of believers in the motherland. That fear only grew when communist rule faltered and the Soviet Union died gasping under the weight of its own delusions. Suddenly, the presence of Romanov descendants in London, Paris, Madrid, and New York was no longer a historical footnote. It was a contingency plan. And Russia, a country that pretends to forget but never truly does, began to look toward those scattered nobles with a dangerous curiosity. Because identity is a compass, and when a nation loses direction, its people search backward for the last star that guided them. In the 1990s, that star was unmistakably Imperial. Ordinary Russians bought icons of Nicholas II's family. Grandmothers told children the truth about saints who once wore crowns. The royal bones, once hidden, were retrieved and buried with honors. The Kremlin permitted the ceremonies, but kept its eyes open. They recognized a truth bigger than politics. The Romanovs were becoming symbols of destiny once again. And destiny is the only force that can challenge a regime from beneath its own shadow. Many exiled Romanovs kept their distance from direct involvement in Russian affairs. They had seen what happens to those who fly too close to power before the world is ready. But one house, one bloodline, stepped quietly into a role that history almost seemed to script for them. A princess born not in Russian palaces, but in European exile, began making pilgrimages to the land her ancestors ruled. She did not storm stages with royal demands. She did not call for uprisings. She did something far more threatening. She listened. She prayed. She visited the people by invitation, not decree. Russia's church embraced her presence first, recognizing the spiritual lineage within her. The patriarch kissed her hand, not as courtesy but acknowledgement. Then came diplomats, then cultural institutions, then political figures who understood symbolism more fluently than speeches. They offered seats at ceremonies of remembrance, commemorations of the empire, dedications of restore, monuments. One does not invite irrelevance to ceremonies of state. These gestures were not accidents. They were careful tests, measuring public reaction to the possibility of something greater, and the reaction was clear: reverence, not rejection. Soldiers straightened their posture in her presence. Civilians called her Your Highness without hesitation. Veterans placed their hands over their hearts. No one bowed to Soviet politicians like that. No one ever would. The power brokers of the new Russia saw these moments and felt a chill. The Romanov legacy was not a museum exhibit. It was a key, one that could unlock a buried instinct in the Russian heart. The instinct to follow a sacred leader rather than a calculated one. Monarchy is not built on popularity. It is built on inevitability, and inevitability cannot be voted out of office. The Kremlin could ensure stability only by managing the monarchy's return, not provoking it. They found themselves caught in a paradox. The Romanov name was too powerful to suppress, but too unpredictable to fully embrace. So they elevated the past while controlling the present. They funded restorations of imperial palaces, but not coronations. They lit candles at royal graves, but ensured no one knelt too long. They honored the saints, but never spoke of heirs. It was a delicate balance, a recognition of history's gravity without allowing that gravity to pull the future off course. But history is not a polite guest. It does not wait for perfect timing. As Russia reasserted itself on the world stage, threats encircled it once again. Sanctions, propaganda wars, spiritual confusion, internal cynicism, and in that climate the monarchy did not appear as nostalgia. It appeared as a solution. The Romanovs represent continuity in a land addicted to collapse and resurrection. They represent legitimacy that cannot be stolen through ballots or violence. They represent lineage that stretches so far back that even enemies hesitate to challenge it directly. And that is why, behind closed doors, some of the most powerful figures in Russia today keep a close and quiet line of communication with Romanov royalty. Not because they want an immediate coronation, but because they understand the most ancient rule of authority. In times of chaos, the people turn not to politicians, but to protectors. The crown may sleep, but the instinct to kneel before it has never died. The fifth secret emerges here. The Romanovs were not erased from power. They were placed into reserve. The exiled nobles learned to wait, to watch, to become symbols instead of rulers. And symbols live longer than states. As the 21st century pushes Russia into deeper conflict with the world, as pressure closes in from every direction, the monarchy's appeal doesn't fade. It intensifies. because empires do not ask what is fashionable, they ask what is eternal, and for many Russians, whether they whisper it in the safety of their homes or carry it silently in their hearts, the Romanov crown remains the most eternal force they know. Every empire that falls leaves behind a question, but the Romanov fall left behind a wound. Ordinary deaths fade, but ritual deaths unconsciously demand closure. And if a family has been crowned by God in the eyes of millions, then taking their lives is not execution. It is a spiritual gamble. When the Bolsheviks slaughtered Nicholas II and his family in that locked basement, they believed they were killing the last obstacle to their version of paradise. What they failed to understand is that paradise is never achieved by spilling innocent blood. It is haunted by it. Those responsible thought they were erasing symbols of tyranny. Instead, they created a story of purity confronted by hatred, a story that has always outlived the ideology that attacks it. Nicholas and Alexandra died not as rulers, but as parents holding their children in terror. Their daughters died not as nobles, but as victims shielding one another until the end. That kind of suffering does not vanish into nothing. In Russian theology, it transforms into spiritual force. It becomes a mirror the nation cannot break. For decades, the Soviet machine insisted that the Tsar was a weak fool, a villain deserving punishment. But the more they tried to strip him of dignity, the more dignity hardened around him like armor. A narrative reversal occurred, not suddenly, but relentlessly. The Tsar became a symbol of endurance. The Empress became a symbol of maternal devotion. The children became symbols of innocence crucified by a world drunk on ideology. And this forced a disturbing realization: the revolution did not kill oppressors. It killed a family who did nothing but pray for their son's life and hold on to their duty as they believed God commanded. The execution became a sin that could not be washed from the nation's conscience. The Church understood this immediately. That is why its leaders called the Romanovs passion bearers, a title given only to those who face death with Christ-like humility, refusing to curse their persecutors even as they suffer. Nicholas and Alexandra spent their final days reading scripture, comforting their children, blessing the guards who whispered insults behind their backs. This was not political theater. This was faith enduring hell. And when bullets shattered the basement air, they did something no ideology could explain. They sanctified the ground with royal blood. The families of executioners often spoke of nightmares, hallucinations, shadows that moved on their own. Strange stories emerged about misfortune, madness, and suicide among those involved. Even the chief killer, Yurovsky, died haunted, unable to convince himself he had served history instead of violating it. The very room where the Romanovs died became so feared that it was eventually destroyed, not for preservation, but to erase the feeling permeating its walls. Nobody destroys something that poses no threat. The Soviet regime tried to smother guilt under concrete, but guilt always rises. And with guilt comes myth. One of the most chilling and persistent beliefs shared quietly among monarchists and Orthodox mystics is that the Romanov children were sacrificial offerings, not to God, but by forces wishing to sever Russia's covenant with God. If a Tsar's blood touches the earth unjustly, legends say the land itself will demand retribution until balance is restored. Look at Russia's fate after 1918. Famine, purges, war upon war, collapse, spiritual desolation. An empire that once crowned rulers beneath golden domes was reduced to cement buildings worshipping nothing. The narrative right is itself. When a protector anointed by heaven is betrayed, heaven steps back and watches mankind drown in the consequences. And yet something remarkable happened the moment the USSR fell. The suffering did not continue downward into oblivion. It began reversing direction. Churches reopened, icons returned, candles burned for the royal saints. It was as if Russia, after decades of wandering in a wilderness crafted by ideology, finally remembered the path home. But here is the darker implication. What if that suffering was not only a consequence, but a purification? In Christianity, martyrs do not merely die, they intercede. The belief among millions of Russians today is that the Romanovs did not vanish. They ascended to a role the revolution could never anticipate. Their agony became their authority. They went from rulers to guardians, from monarchs to metaphysical warriors. Their sainthood is not just a title, it is a declaration that their murder did not end their influence. It magnified it. This is the sixth secret they never wanted the world to understand. The Romanovs' death was not defeat. It was the ignition of a power rooted not in laws or armies, but in the spiritual bloodstream of the nation. And that power does not weaken with time. It intensifies every time their story is told. Every candle lit beneath their icon is an act of rebellion against the ideology that killed them. Every child taught their names inherits a loyalty that bullets fail to erase. A revolution can silence a nation. It cannot silence a myth, and myths, once awakened, do not return to sleep. The Romanovs are saints, not to honor the past, but to prepare the future. Sainthood is not memory. Sainthood is mobilization. In Section 9, we turn to the future that terrifies every ruling elite, the possibility that the Romanovs' sacrifice was not merely symbolic, but strategic, positioning them for a return that challenges both earthly and spiritual powers alike. Because empires built on propaganda fear only one opponent, a resurrected truth. Narratives that survive executions and revolutions do so because they contain something people feel as much as believe. The Romanovs were not just a family. They became a symbol of a Russia that once saw itself chosen for greatness, and symbols, when pressed underground by fear, don't rot. They ferment. They grow richer, more volatile, more capable of rewriting the future once they erupt back into the world. Today, millions of Russians visit the Romanovs' shrine not out of nostalgia, but because they believe their story is unfinished, that their sacrifice was a hinge, not a period. This is where geopolitics and prophecy collide, and where powerful institutions tremble in silence. There is a belief, spoken quietly among monarchists and loudly among mystics, that the fall of the Romanovs marked not the end of divine destiny, but its recalibration. The execution did not sever God's relationship with Russia. It tested it, and every trial invites a return. For centuries, the Russian Church held a prophecy that a true sovereign, a righteous monarch, would one day rise again to restore the nation's spiritual purpose. The prophecy slept while the state replaced saints with slogans. But prophecies do not require permission from governments to awaken. As Russia struggles against a world shaping itself through economic manipulation, cultural fragmentation, and moral ambiguity, many see the monarchy not as regression, but restoration, a return to the cosmic order that once made Russia feel invulnerable. In the minds of believers, democracy fractures identity. Monarchies unify it. The difference is loyalty. A president commands obedience through fear of punishment or hope of reward. A monarch commands it through belonging. That distinction is a seismic threat to every modern ideology that relies on citizens seeing themselves as consumers, units of labor, or numbers in a poll. Monarchies activate the one instinct the modern world fears: devotion. It is not an accident that as Russia reclaims its orthodox soul, as the double-headed eagle rises again, as icons of the Tsar stand beside soldiers heading into battle, a new question burns hotter each year. Who will inherit the crown if destiny calls it forth? The answer is no longer theoretical. There are living Romanovs, descendants who carry the blood of Michael I, Peter the Great, Catherine's empire, and Nicholas's martyrdom. They are neither extinct nor powerless, merely exiled from the throne, but not from the story. In the last decade, high-ranking clergy and influential cultural leaders have begun speaking more openly about the monarchy's potential role in the nation's future. Not as political rulers, perhaps, but as spiritual anchors, the heart behind the state's fist. And once a crown returns spiritually, the physical crown rarely stays buried for long. This terrifies global elites whose systems depend on people believing history only moves forward. If monarchy returns in Russia, the idea spreads. Nations that abandon their kings might begin asking why. If a sainted ruler ascends, republics that claim divine neutrality must confront the possibility they were never neutral, only disconnected. Power structures built on ideology crack when confronted with power structures built on identity and faith. That is why, as whispers of restoration increase, counter-narratives also sharpen. Monarchy is outdated, monarchy is dangerous, monarchy is oppression reborn. Because if people believe the crown is legitimate, that it is destiny rather than nostalgia, then their allegiance shifts from institutions of law to institutions of spirit. And institutions of spirit are almost impossible to overthrow. The myth's momentum is visible everywhere. New documentaries, viral videos, schoolchildren learning the names of the imperial saints, modern royals invited to ceremonies the Soviets once eradicated. Even political leaders pay respect to Romanov anniversaries, not because they must, but because they fear the symbolism of staying silent. Silence implies distance. Distance implies insecurity. In Russia, insecurity invites destiny to intervene. And destiny, when summoned, rarely arrives quietly. But here lies the darkest tension. Should the monarchy return, it will not return as it once existed. The world has changed. Power has evolved. Thrones can no longer rely solely on divine right. They must command both the sacred and the strategic. The next Tsar, if he or she emerges, will rule not from palaces alone, but from memory weaponized into identity. Their authority would come not from armies, but from the unmet longing of a people who want to feel chosen again. When a population decides that its story needs a royal chapter, no parliament can close the book. This is the seventh secret. The Romanovs' future depends not on the living heirs, but on the spiritual momentum of their death. Martyrdom gave them immortality. Sainthood gave them legitimacy. Memory gave them a mandate. And mandate is the currency that rulers spend when the world reaches a breaking point. In Section 10, we confront that breaking point. The moment when a nation realizes it must choose between the fragile security of a system built on fear and the terrifying promise of a destiny built on divit. Authority. Because history is no longer a record of what was. It is a warning of what is coming. Every empire eventually reaches a crossroads where its illusions can no longer protect it. Russia today stands precisely there, torn between the world it was forced to become and the world it was born to be. Modern institutions preach order, stability, and constitutional logic. But beneath those structures beats something ancient, something the Soviet era tried to erase, yet only reawakened. A nation does not survive 1,000 years by accident. It survives because its identity is forged in fire, invasion, famine, and faith, the kind of forces that grind weak civilizations into dust while forging strong ones into iron. Russia remembers that it was not built by committees or federations. It was carved by autocrats who believed their authority came from the heavens, not from the ballot box. The cracks in the present system began forming the moment Russia regained its voice after the Soviet collapse. Economic turmoil, corruption, foreign pressure, all these fractures leaked a single profound question into public consciousness. If the state fails again, who or what will take the throne of legitimacy? Not just the throne of government, the throne of meaning. Because nations do not die when their economies fail. They die when their people forget why they exist. And in Russia, that why was once carried by a crown that claimed lineage from both emperors and saints. Modern leaders know this, even if they never say it aloud. That is why they surround themselves with imperial symbols, double-headed eagles, orthodox blessings, parades that feel more Romanov than Soviet. It is a performance meant to reassure the subconscious of the nation. Your protectors still embody destiny, but performances reveal insecurity. When a government feels strong, it has no need to dress itself in borrowed grandeur. When it feels the ground shifting, it scrambles for icons with real weight. Meanwhile, the Romanovs do not have to lift a finger. Their story is working silently inside the culture. Every prayer before their relics is a vote cast for the return of sacred authority. Every candle lit beneath their icons is a reminder that the people have not forgotten who once guided them. The monarchy is no longer a system. It is a memory with teeth. And memory, especially sacred memory, is the most unstoppable political force on earth. The Church understands this better than anyone. In Orthodox tradition, the Tsar is not merely a ruler. He is a katechon, a restrainer of chaos. When the Tsar falls, disorder is unleashed. Many believers look at the century after 1918 and see not progress, but prophecy fulfilled. War, purges, moral confusion, collapse. If the fall of the Tsar opened the gates to suffering, then the return of the Tsar could be the key to closing them. You may laugh at such thinking, but millions do not. And belief, not statistics, is what reshapes destiny. This puts the current Russian state in a fascinating trap. It relies on the Church for legitimacy. It relies on imperial myth for unity. But the Church and the myth both trace authority to a family the state cannot fully resurrect without risking its own irrelevance. A monarchy restored by divine legacy would hold a kind of power no president could rival, not even one loved by the people. The moment a crowned Romanov steps forward, sanctified by suffering, validated by prophecy, and embraced by a population hungry for identity, every institution built since 1917 becomes temporary scaffolding around a cathedral whose original roof is waiting to be lifted. Back into place. And there is a darker side still. Chaos does not ask permission before it arrives. A major political fracture, a war gone wrong, a spiritual crisis. Any shock large enough could cause millions to declare in a single breath that modern governance has failed, and destiny must intervene. It would not begin with coronations or proclamations. It would begin with a whispered statement that becomes a roar. We are a monarchy by soul, not by system. Once that shift occurs, the Romanovs would not need to seize power. Power would seek them. Here lies the eighth secret. The most dangerous throne is always the one destined, not elected. You cannot argue with it. You cannot campaign against it. You can only kneel or oppose it, and opposing destiny has a short half-life. This is why global powers keep their eyes fixed on Russia's spiritual axis. A nation that feels chosen again does not bend. It conquers. And a nation guided by a sacred crown, rather than by fear or transaction, could alter the balance of the world in a single generation. Because armies fight for nations. They die for symbols. In Section 11 we explore the unimaginable. If the Romanovs rise again, what kind of Russia rises with them? A nation of faith and force that answers not to modern diplomacy, but to an ancient sense of mission. A Russia that believes history never ended their empire, merely paused it. Because once a people decides they are not finished, history obeys. Power is not measured by who rules today, it is measured by who shapes tomorrow. The Romanovs lost palaces, armies, treaties, but they never lost the imagination of their people. And imagination, once ignited, becomes blueprint. Russia today balances between two worlds. On paper, a modern state built through geopolitics and industry. In spirit, a slumbering empire carved from theology, myth, and sacrifice. When these worlds overlap, stability feels strong. But when they separate, when real hardship returns, the people follow the path that promises meaning, not merely survival. And meaning has never come from parliaments or parties. It came from a crown. Every era of Russia has been defined by crisis birthing a greater form of authority. When the Kievan Rus collapsed, the Grand Princes rose. When the Mongols weakened, Moscow claimed destiny. When dynasties shattered, the Romanovs unified a dying land. Now, the modern government stands in the same torch-lit corridor, staring at the same locked door. Behind it waits a throne that never truly left. A terrifying truth lurks beneath the Kremlin's foundations. If the current system falters, even for a moment, the people will not beg for another elected manager. They will beg for certainty, and certainty wears a crown. This fear quietly guides every major decision Russia's rulers make. They speak of the great Russian state, but they decorate it with imperial symbols. They condemn the monarchy's flaws, yet canonize its leaders. They reject royal rules, while operating inside its aesthetic. Because the moment they stop honoring the empire, the people will wonder why those ruling them do not possess the same sacred authority as their predecessors. And once that question is asked too loudly, it cannot be silenced. Meanwhile, the Romanovs themselves play a masterclass in patience. They attend memorials for ancestors who once commanded armies of millions. They smile beside presidents who know full well that tradition can become power in an instant. They take photos with generals whose grandfathers might have fought under the double-headed eagle. One day, historians will ask, was this subtle diplomacy or quiet preparation? But history rarely informs participants of the role they're playing until the curtain rises. The Church watches carefully. For centuries, it crowned the nation's leaders, not as a formality, but as a declaration that the ruler answered to a higher authority. Today, the Church stands as the only institution with enough moral gravity to legitimize a throne's return. And the Church gains strength every year that global chaos increases. The West's fractured culture, the collapse of absolute truths, the abandonment of tradition, all serve as warnings to, they believed God commanded. The execution became a sin that could not be washed from the nation's conscience. The Church understood this immediately. That is why its leaders, called the Romanovs, passion bearers, a title given only to those who face death with Christ-like humility, refusing to curse their persecutors even as they suffer. Nicholas and Alexandra spent their final days reading scripture, comforting their children, blessing the guards who whispered insults behind their backs. This was not political theater. This was faith enduring hell. And when bullets shattered the basement air, they did something no ideology could explain. They sanctified the ground with royal blood. The families of executioners often spoke of nightmares, hallucinations, shadows that moved on their own. Strange stories emerged about misfortune, madness, and suicide among those involved. Even the chief killer, Yurovsky, died haunted, unable to convince himself he had served history instead of violating it. The very room where the Romanovs died became so feared that it was eventually destroyed, not for preservation, but to erase the feeling permeating its walls. Nobody destroys something that poses no threat. The Soviet regime tried to smother guilt under concrete, but guilt always rises. And with guilt comes myth. One of the most chilling and persistent beliefs shared quietly among monarchists and Orthodox mystics is that the Romanov children were sacrificial offerings, not to God, but by forces wishing to sever Russia's covenant with God. If a Tsar's blood touches the earth unjustly, legends say the land itself will demand retribution until balance is restored. Look at Russia's fate after 1918. Famine, purges, war upon war, collapse, spiritual desolation. An empire that once crowned rulers beneath golden domes was reduced to cement buildings worshipping nothing. The narrative right is itself. When a protector anointed by heaven is betrayed, heaven steps back and watches mankind drown in the consequences. And yet something remarkable happened the moment the USSR fell. The suffering did not continue downward into oblivion. It began reversing direction. Churches reopened, icons returned, candles burned for the royal saints. It was as if Russia, after decades of wandering in a wilderness crafted by ideology, finally remembered the path home. But here is the darker implication. What if that suffering was not only a consequence, but a purification? In Christianity, martyrs do not merely die, they intercede. The belief among millions of Russians today is that the Romanovs did not vanish. They ascended to a role the revolution could never anticipate. Their agony became their authority. They went from rulers to guardians, from monarchs to metaphysical warriors. Their sainthood is not just a title, it is a declaration that their murder did not end their influence. It magnified it. This is the sixth secret they never wanted the world to understand. The Romanovs' death was not defeat. It was the ignition of a power rooted not in laws or armies, but in the spiritual bloodstream of the nation. And that power does not weaken with time. It intensifies every time their story is told. Every candle lit beneath their icon is an act of rebellion against the ideology that killed them. Every child taught their names inherits a loyalty that bullets fail to erase. A revolution can silence a nation. It cannot silence a myth. And myths, once awakened, do not return to sleep. The Romanovs are saints, not to honor the past, but to prepare the future. Sainthood is not memory. Sainthood is mobilization. In Section 9, we turn to the future that terrifies every ruling elite. The possibility that the Romanovs' sacrifice was not merely symbolic, but strategic. Russians do not follow this path. And if the answer to moral collapse is found in the past, then that past carries a name. Every empire believes it is eternal, until the moment it realizes it was merely a steward. The Soviet Union believed it had ended monarchy forever. Instead, it merely prepared the ground for its resurrection. Global elites believed the world had outgrown sacred authority. Instead, we have entered an age starving for meaning. Economies rise and fall, ideologies come and go. But identity, the deep knowledge of who we are, is the one thing history cannot shake loose. And the Russian identity was written not in ink, but in blood, the blood of saints who wore crowns. Here is the ninth secret. Stability is temporary, but destiny is permanent, and Russia has always chosen destiny. Every crisis, every humiliation, every external threat has pushed the nation closer to embracing the symbols that protected it when the world was colder and darker and more honest about what it takes to survive. The final question now is not if monarchy could return, but why wouldn't it? Why would a country accept leaders who rule for a term when it once had rulers who governed for generations with purpose tied to heaven itself? Why trust a system that changes based on moods, scandals, and votes? When you could trust blood, lineage, and divine mission? Why cling to temporary power when eternal power stands waiting in the wings? We are approaching the climax of this story, the part where history reveals what the last century truly meant. The fall of the Romanovs was not a conclusion. It was a delay, a test, a purification through fire and famine and forgetting. And now, the forgetting is ending. As we prepare for the final section, think carefully about this. What happens when a nation that has suffered 100 years without its sacred protector suddenly decides it wants him back? That moment would not look like nostalgia. It would look like judgment. In Section 12, the final descent, we confront the end of the lie, the moment when Russia remembers that its throne was never given away. It was stolen, and stolen things call out to be reclaimed. Listen closely now, because this is the part they hope you never reach, the point where history stops being a graveyard and becomes a mirror, the place where a dynasty's death reveals the shape of your own life, and a secret family in a locked basement teaches you how to rule yourself. The truth is simple and terrifying. The Romanovs fell because a world without sacred authority always tries to amputate what reminds it of the sky. But what bullets cannot kill is meaning. And meaning is what crowns men. And tonight, the crown is no longer an object of state or ceremony, but a test placed in your hands. If you've walked with me through the famine and the fire, if you felt the basement cold and the echoing shots, if you saw how memory turned their blood into light, then understand this final passage. The crown returns first as conscience, then as discipline, then as destiny, and that sequence is not about palaces or parades. It's about the spine you build when the world demands that you kneel to anything except the truth. The men who erased the Romanovs believed they were ending a bloodline. What they accidentally unleashed was a pattern, and that pattern lives every time a man refuses to be ruled by his appetite or his fear, and instead stands under a higher law, the way a Tsar did under God. A throne is only wood without that alignment, and a man is only a statistic without it. So the first coronation you must witness is the private one. The moment you decide that your life cannot be explained by trends and slogans and algorithms because you are not a consumer of history, you are the heir to it, and heirs do not beg for meaning, they inherit it and guard it with their breath. The Romanovs rose in a wasteland and kept a continent from tearing itself apart. You rise in a digital wasteland designed to conquer your attention and then your will. They faced mobs on cobblestones, you face mobs in your mind. They had to choose between fear and duty. You must choose between distraction and duty. The distance between those choices is smaller than you think, and that is why their story refused to die. Because it is not finished as long as men remain unfinished, and men remain unfinished until they take an oath. The saints in their icons are not asking you to worship tragedy. They are asking you to weaponize memory, to burn away comfort, to rebuild the hierarchy inside you where discipline outranks impulse, prayer outranks panic, courage outranks approval, and legacy outranks leisure. This is how a fallen empire begins to breathe again, through citizens who are more like kings than consumers. Men who act as if the border between sacred and ordinary runs through their own chests and must be guarded night and day. You wanted forbidden knowledge. Here it is. The darkest power in any age is the mechanism that persuades a man to disown his lineage, to mock his fathers, to break every allegiance except to his hunger. That mechanism has many names: ideology, entertainment, nihilism. But its goal is one: a world without crowns, because it has made a world without men. The counterspell is as ancient as the double-headed eagle. Remember who you are. Shoulder a duty that hurts. Tie your life to something that outlives it, and let the weight of that oath press you into shape. The Romanovs returned as saints, not to rule a parliament, but to rule a question. What kind of man survives an age that feeds on passivity? And the answer comes back like iron. He who crowns himself with responsibility, he who carries a quiet scepter called self-mastery. He who governs his time, his words, his appetites, and treats his home like a province entrusted to him by heaven. The flag of such a man is order in a chaotic room, prayer in a noisy morning, restraint when provoked, endurance when ignored, generosity when unseen. These are not soft virtues, they are imperial ones, because the smallest throne is the one no tyrant can invade, the throne behind your ribs. Perhaps you thought this was a story about palaces and pedigrees. It is, but it is also a manual smuggled across a century, telling you that nothing powerful can remain on earth unless it is first enthroned in the soul. Revolutions can topple governments, but they cannot topple a father who stands where he said he would stand. A husband who loves when it is hard to love, a leader who bleeds quietly for people who will never know his name. That is sacred power. And sacred power is why the Romanovs still stand in gold leaf, watching from icon windows while men decide whether to become archives or ancestors. This is the final revelation. Sainthood is not escape. It is engagement. It is the conversion of pain into guidance and loss into law. It is the authority of those who endured without accusing God and were therefore trusted to remind us that crowns are not stolen by bullets, they are surrendered by sloth. History begs you not to repeat that surrender, so walk to your mirror tonight and make the vow the revolution hoped you would never swear. I will not live as a passenger of my century. I will rule what has been given to me, my habits, my household, my craft, my word, and I will answer to something higher than mood or trend. Do that, and the Romanovs rise again where no enemy can harm them. Do that, and the saints in their paintings nod. Do that, and you have understood the only return that truly matters, the return of hierarchy within the heart. If the world ever see rounds kings again, it will be because ordinary men practiced monarchy in secret, ordering their lives with priestly reverence and soldierly resolve until the age itself bowed to their example, and if the world refuses, then the throne remains where it has always been waiting, in the quiet center of a man who knows what he is for. The dynasty that ruled for 303 years fell in one night and returned as saints did not come back to give you sentiment. They came back to give you orders. Carry your name with honor, keep your oath when it breaks you, build something you cannot finish, protect something you cannot own, kneel only to what is worthy, and rise only when someone else needs the strength. That is the coronation, that is the secret. That is the crown that survived the bullets, and if you understood even half of this, you know exactly where to wear it.